Ready? Good morning and welcome to the Community Remembers Coalition Chatham Women's History Program. I am Mary Nettles, president of the Community Remembers Coalition Chatham. I am honored to have the pleasure to introduce you to Blair Lynn Murphy Kelley. Dr. Kelley is the Joel R. Williamson Distinguished Professor of Southern Studies at UNC Chapel Hill. She is the director of the Center for the Study of the American South and co-director of Southern Future. Her work focused primarily on Black American South and its activist legacy. Dr. Kelley is an award-winning author, historian, and scholar of the African American experience, a dedicated public historian. She worked to amplify the stories of Black people with a focus on everyday impact of their activities. Dr. Kelley is the author of Right to Ride Streetcar, Boycott, and African American Citizen. Dr. Kelley's family inspired her to write her newest book, Black Folks, The Roots of the Black Working Class. She used her family and how she connected her family stories to the stories of the Black working class in general. The Root of the Black Working Class, which was selected as one of Smithsonian Best Books of 2023, received the 2024 Philip Staff Labor History Prize and 2024 Brooklyn Library Book Prize, Nonfiction, and the 2024 Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Book Award, and was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Award in History. Dr. Kelley was also awarded a 2020 Creative Nonfiction Grant by the Writing Foundation and the 2022-2023 John Hope Franklin NEH Fellowship by the National Humanities Center. Dr. Kelley believed it is essential to engage with diversity audience in telling the history of the South and respond in creative and compelling ways to contextualize our past. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kelley today.
Thank you, Ms. Mary, and thank you all for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be here to talk with you about my work, particularly in the moment of Women's History Month, when we have to think about the contributions that women made to our country, which are so substantive and so long-running. I want to start.
Ms. Blair, can you speak in the mic? I don't think some can.
You can't hear me?
Because I can barely.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll be close to the mic. I wanted to start with a photograph of my family. Of course, in the middle is my grandfather, John D. Duncan. If you knew him, you would understand why he was so comfortable and in the middle, because that was his personality, to always take center stage in family gatherings. Off on the side wearing yellow is my grandmother, on the side closest to me. And if you understood her, you would understand why she was on the end, because she never wanted anyone to really pay attention to her. She just wanted to get things done. In this picture is my grandfather's brothers and sisters, and his sister-in-laws and his brother-in-law. And right behind him is his big brother, O.B. When you read the book, you'll see that those two start out the story that I talk about in Black Folk. This is my grandfather, John D., when he first migrates to Philadelphia from Thomasville, North Carolina. I love that picture because it has his city suit, but he still has on his work boots at the bottom, if you'll see. And people have asked me if the woman in the doorway is my grandmother, and I don't know. That's my grandmother, right after she migrated to Philadelphia and was in search of employment in the city. And so I'll talk a lot about the ways in which her story taught me a lot about the experience of Black women in this time period. This is my paternal grandfather, Theodore Brooks Murphy, and my Aunt Jean. This is soon after he migrated from Accomack County, probably like about a decade after he migrated from Accomack County, Virginia to Philadelphia. And this is my great grandfather, solicitor, a picture of him held up, I believe, by my Aunt Lucille, but I couldn't know because I can't see her. But so he really, his story of survival is where I begin my book. So I want to read a little bit to you about that. The sound of his father's voice at a whisper startled him out of his sleep. Mm-hmm. Is it on? Is it? It's making noise?
A little more volume.
It wasn't on.
Oh, that's
First step. The sound of his father's voice at a whisper startled him out of his sleep. On Sundays, John D. loved hearing Solicitor's baritone, especially when it reverberated off the walls of the tiny wooden church, his father singing until the Spirit moved the congregation to shout, even before he began to preach. On weekdays, John D. was also accustomed to hearing Solicitor bellow across the wide field just outside Cannon, Georgia, warning him to stop playing the dozens with his big brother O.B. and get back to work. But that unusual night, when he heard Solicitor's voice lowered, he knew things were serious. Even as a rebellious teen, John D. was not in the habit of talking back to his father, but that night there was a particular urgency in his father's tone that made it clear that there was no time to ask what was happening. Following directions, John D. packed without lighting the lantern he usually used to illuminate his steps. Muffling his curiosity, he helped his brothers and sisters load the wagon, using the moonlight as their guide. What my maternal grandfather, then only 14 years old, did know was that just a few days prior, his father had come home empty-handed after settlement with the white man who owned the land Solicitor Duncan's sharecrop. However, that year, the plantation owner told Solicitor that the harvest, several massive bales of cotton, had produced nothing but a debt. Indeed, he claimed that after 1 year of hard work in the fields, Solicitor owed him. The owner, who had not even turned over his hands to make the land productive, decided to keep all the shares, knowing that there was nothing a Black man, even a man as esteemed within the Black community as Pastor Solicitor Duncan, could do about it. Born there in Northeast Georgia, Solicitor had done this work all his life, breaking the hard red clay to plant the rows, pulling weeds, irrigating the young plants, and then carefully harvesting soft-licked cotton from the hard boils until his fingers were numb. Solicitor knew what he deserved. Young John D. had watched his father go over the math based on the market value of the harvest over and over. The cash settlement was essential for the annual purchases his family needed and to his ability to care for his sick wife. As furious as Solicitor was, he dared not speak up. Any public hint of anger, even a calm and measured protest, could result in a lynch mob appearing in front of their home. So when the landowner lied and gave him nothing but a debt against that next year's crop, Solicitor determined that there would be no next year in that place. He decided to take his family and run. And so for me, what's been a powerful intervention in how I'm thinking about the Black working class and Black people's labor over time is that when I was in graduate school, the working class simply focused on people in cities, factory work. I didn't talk about agricultural work. It didn't include Black women working in households. It didn't include a lot of the labor that my family had done. It focused on union organizing in the 20th century, and it really excluded the stories of my family. And so when I was asked to write about the Black working class, I wanted to sort of think through their lens at what was important, where their lessons came from, how they understood the world, and what mattered to them. And it was an interesting process to think about what's particular about Black working people. My editor came to me with the idea of this book, and he said, you know, there's a few books out about the white working class. There's a book called White Trash by Nancy Eisenberg that was very popular. There was a pretty successful book called Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. And so he said, you know, there's some books out here. What if we do it from a Black point of view? And then he said to me, what is Black trash? And I said, nothing. That's the opposite of what I had ever been taught to think about in terms of Black working people. You could be poor, but you were never trash. That my grandfather taught me to esteem people who worked, that everyone's labor is worth its due if you do it unto God, is what he always taught me. And so there was never any disrespect for work. There was an understanding of the struggle up behind it, but there was no disrespect. And so that's when I realized, you know, you can't simply write this book from a parallel, looking for what happened to white people and then simply trying to find that match in Black life. That the Black journey in America is a unique one and a different one, and one that has to be understood from their own perspective and their own roots. And so that was what started my journey in this story. And so I started with my family, but it's important to note that my family is not unusual or different than anyone else. They didn't start organizations. They aren't found in formal archives. They don't have paper collections. They are everyday people. But the power of looking at everyday people is incredibly important. There are more everyday people than there are folks who end up having paper collections or leading organizations. And they have lessons to give us about what matters. And so thinking about the roots of my family, part of what was important to me, oh no, did I do something? It went out, oh, it's back, okay. It's temperamental. Part of what was important to me was to think about the unique roots of Black life. When I was growing up and kids wanted to slur me or attack me for being one of the few Black girls in my school in South Jersey, where we were integrating the school, they would say, go back to Africa. And it was interesting because I was in New Jersey. And so most of those kids I was going to school with, they were maybe second generation Americans, oftentimes first. There was a good friend of mine who was born in Italy. And so I just always found it striking that Black people weren't thought of as American. But I can trace my family line back to before the American Revolution, as people in bondage and people who were freed in the state of Maryland. And even though I can't trace the enslaved ancestors back that far, I know that their roots go that far in terms of the families who owned them and held them in bondage. Because of the close of the international trade in 1808, we know that 90% of Black Americans who were enslaved were here before the American Revolution. That's when the bulk of the trade happened. And so our ancestry is as deep as any Americans, and oftentimes deeper. And so thinking about our roots, for me, had to begin in enslavement and the unique journey that folks took. I had a chance to research my family in Georgia, and I found an enslaved ancestor in the records of his slaveholder. I found the will that the slaveholder had, and I found his name there that listed him as a blacksmith. And so it was just for me a reminder that the labor of Black Americans built this country. The labor of my ancestors and the labor of so many people's ancestors was the infrastructure of the nation. And I think one of the most important things I wanted to do was to remind readers that Black existence is not just about suffering or what happened to us, but that Black people had their own perspective on the world from the very beginning. Even as enslaved people, they understood what was happening around them. I'm currently working on a book about Emancipation Day celebrations that I really need to finish. And what has been striking to me is the understanding of enslaved people about news, about politics, about the war, about how they could leverage themselves to get free and to make an impact on creating a world where they were all free. And so that perspective has to be blended into how we understand the Black working class as free people, that they were not being acted upon, they were also acting upon the world and trying to build the world that they wanted to see. And so their perspective, their keen observations about the world mattered so much. And Black people built powerful institutions in the first decades after their freedom. This is a baptism that happens one county over from the county where my ancestors were from in Georgia. I love that woman in the corner. She's looking back at the camera with that beautiful hat on. And what's really powerful here for me is the way that Black people were builders. They were creators of communities of faith, of communities of support, working people, supporting one another, feeding one another, caring for one another, and filling in those gaps that they found in their everyday life. And that story also has to be told. That story is important. Additionally, I started to think about the organizations that I found when I was doing research. And I found that well before the 1930s, when there are white labor organizers who come from the North down south to organize unions and build those organizations, Black people were organizing unions on their own from the very first moments of freedom. They didn't need to be taught about the politics behind their labor. They simply understood it. They could see it for themselves and they understood it. And so the consciousness was already there and embedded in the community. And being people who didn't always have the ability to make space for those things without being in trouble, they had to find new and clandestine ways to do it. And among the very best were Black women who served as washerwomen. I was excited to write about women who were doing this labor. It was really in my spirit. One of my very my favorite books is a book called To Joy My Freedom by a historian named Tara Hunter. And I read it in graduate school, and it was just a guide for me to think about what freedom looked like in those first generations. And her book is all focused on washerwomen and their impact and their activism. And so I thought, well, I'll have to include that in my book, and I'll include a couple chapters. And I ran into Tara Hunter at a conference, and she was like, just a couple chapters. So I was like, would you already wrote a whole book? And what was powerful, thank you. What was powerful here was the degree to which washerwomen, didn't make a lot of money. They weren't respected as important, but they were making an impact from the very first moments. My great-grandmother, my namesake, Julia Blair Rayford, was a washerwoman in Thomasville, North Carolina in the 40s. I didn't find her in the sense of doing that work until the very end of the book project, but I felt it. I had heard it and I felt it, and I just had to find confirmation. I was so glad when I did. And so what was powerful for me was to really slow down and think about women's work and its impact. I'm a person who is not that good at laundry, and I'm really much worse at pressing, like really bad. My mom used to just get on me about rough, dry clothes and things like that. And when I studied the washerwomen, really began to have a deep appreciation of their skill and of their knowledge about how to wash clothes. They were washing clothes in a time before there was industrial soap, so they had to make their own soap. They found refuse and things to burn to make the fires that they used to heat their kettles to boiling. They had concoctions of different things that they could use to raise stains of clays and different things. They would blue the clothes to make them look white. They would press the clothes, heating an iron. I always tease my students, like, the iron is called an iron because it used to be made of iron, and it was heavy and hot all over. This picture here is of a woman with an iron where she had to wrap rags around the handle to keep from burning her hand. And so you had to really know what you were doing to press something and to temperature regulate, to heat it on some coals or on a stove. And it was a lot of knowledge and skill that they used to do this work. Now, technically, historians would call them unskilled labor. They would say that, skilled labor is masonry and bricklaying and carpentry and things like that. But what was powerful for me is to think through all those steps of, now if someone makes soap, we call it artisanal soap, and we pay a lot for the bar, But they knew how to do all those things before there was an internet to teach you. And they passed those things down generation to generation. And it was really a powerful set of skills. The other thing is that Black women negotiated where they wanted to do this work. At the moment of freedom, many former slaveholders wanted Black women to be in their households to do laundry, as they had done as women in bondage. And they insisted that they would be able to take the laundry to their own homes, their own yards, and do it on their own terms. They set a schedule that gave them a week to get this stuff, pick up, to drop off. And that schedule you can find mirrored all over the American South. And the practice of doing this work as work that comes out is also the majority of the ways in which Black women did this work in the South too. So you'll see in this picture a woman, in a yard. The line is probably shared amongst women who were doing this work together. The other thing that was really powerful about laundry work is that Black women were able to do this work with their children, and watch their children and train their children in how to do it themselves, and also just to be with them. As enslaved women, oftentimes they were separated from their children. We'll remember in Frederick Douglass's autobiography, he said he could not remember what his mother's face looked like because he only saw her sneak into the quarters where he was staying at night. So he never saw her face in the daylight, and she did not raise him. And so that separation was painful for Black women in slavery. And so they valued that time with their children and being able to raise their own families in their own homes. They were not wealthy women, but they were making choices that made their lives richer and were important to them. That separation from white households also kept those women safe. Oftentimes in the stories of women who have to work in white households, many of them become victims of assault, of sexual assault. It's very common because they had really no means to fight back. No law enforcement would help them. No one would be able to speak up freely for them because of the danger of saying the truth. And so doing laundry work at home kept them safe, and they could create a barrier between themselves and the outside world as best they could. The other exciting piece that I found when I was studying the washerwomen is that they organized. The most striking organization that I found was that in 1866, the women of Jackson, Mississippi, organized a union. They created a set of terms about how much they wanted to make, where they wanted to do their work, how they wanted to do it, that they would take holidays off. They would not wash clothes on Christmas or Easter. They would set up their own schedule, and they were demanding this. They turned this letter into the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, about the terms that they wanted. So again, I'll say in 1866, the year after the emancipation, Black women, washerwomen, were organizing a union. No more powerful example could I have run into of their determination and the importance of this work. And so their resistance enabled them to be leaders in other struggles. We see washerwomen joining in other union strikes throughout the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. We see washerwomen participating in the streetcar boycotts that I wrote about in my first book that happened between 1900 and 1906, carrying their loads on their heads rather than taking streetcars. It was a heavy toll that mirrors the kind of toll that the Montgomery bus boycott had on working Black women in that city. But they were willing to do it, and they were fighting for dignity and their rights in a really strong way. These were not well-paid women. They were considered at the bottom of society's rung, but they really weren't, because they were so powerful in their independence and what they were able to build. Another thing that was so striking to me is I studied a place called Accomack, Virginia, where my grandfather was from, and I happened to find an interview with a Black woman who was a domestic laborer in Philadelphia. And she was originally from Accomack, and she had done agricultural work there. And so I wanted to study the place because I was like, wow, I found an interview from where my grandfather's from. This is great. Let me dive deep. And so in my search, I discovered a whole labor movement and what resulted in what we used to call race riots, but a racial attack on the Black community there a decade before either of them were born. And I was struck. I was like, Accomack is very rural, kind of isolated because of where it sits physically on the eastern shore of Virginia. But I found a whole labor movement. I was writing a book about labor. I was like, oh, this is good. So what was powerful in this movement was there was a co-op of white potato growers in Accomack who, because of the new train that connected Accomack with Philadelphia and then New York, they had a new market for their potatoes. And so farmers could join the co-op, and they were becoming millionaires because of that crop. They were really supplying potatoes for the whole East Coast at a certain point. But systematically, Black people were not allowed to join the co-op. Black farmers, Black sharecroppers, Black workers, they were shut out completely. They could not pay the fees to join. And so they began to organize in response to that, to pull their labor out of the fields, to say we're not going to harvest the potatoes at harvest time. I saw a write-up of this protest in the New York Times because they were talking about the markets there in potatoes and how this was a threat and people better get it together. So Accomack was in the New York Times. And so what was really powerful was that organizing can happen in places where you don't think it would have or should have happened, right? That we're told that these kinds of places aren't part of that pantheon of what important things are happening in terms of protest. But I found that they were, and it was really powerful. There were two young men who had gone off to Hampton University and returned to Accomack to help organize those workers, and they built an agricultural fair for Black farmers and workers in the area. And they were really encouraging a set of determinations, and they were attacked for it. They were not murdered, but they were jailed. But organizers in Richmond, Virginia got them free, and one of them won a settlement for the value of his property that was burned down in the attack, and started another business in Baltimore. And so the determination of people to organize and to fight was really remarkable. But a reminder that in most places, this kind of fight didn't happen. In most places, they would be killed. In most places, they wouldn't have survived what was going on. So it was an extraordinary story, but a remarkable one at the same time. And so I started thinking about what that organization looked like. There are no records, of course, of what they did, but I pictured them meeting when they went into town, using church gatherings as a place where they could meet one another and talk about what was going on in fraternal halls. When they would go into town to sell their crops, get a Coke, they might be talking in lower tones. They might be definitely talking in the fields as they were harvesting and picking and supporting one another in this work. And so it's important for us to imagine the things that we cannot find in the written record, but that we know from the other habits of life that we see. I also was excited to write about the Pullman porters and the Pullman maids who are the building blocks of a Black working class in the United States, and really the beginnings of a Black middle class because of their success in organizing. I wrote about a man named Oscar Singleton, who was from South Carolina. He becomes a Pullman porter. He talked about the difficulty of doing the work. I wanted to focus first on the challenge of the work and how hard it was. Oftentimes we just see the Pullman story told from the organizing perspective, but it was a reminder of how they had to tolerate things that were really difficult. They had to tolerate insults and degrading treatment, long work hours. And so the union that gets organized in the 1930s is a powerful response that enables them to have more support in the work they're doing. And so the stereotypes of the Black workers who were involved in the Pullman Company were really powerful. You see in this ad that, the requirement really is to smile and to be pleasant. The roots of having an all-Black labor force inside the Pullman sleeping cars came from their founder, George Mortimer Pullman, who invented the sleeping car berth, where the seats could be transformed from daytime seating into nighttime sleeping in privacy. So he wanted Black men and women to be waiting hand and foot on those passengers who had this premium transformation. He wanted to hark back to an imagined antebellum South where you might have Black servants waiting on you. An interesting proposition for a New Yorker who had never experienced enslavement or slavery around him, but the stories in the American imaginary were what he tapped into. And so what was powerful here is that in his intention to have porters and maids waiting on folks, he wanted folks who were well-educated. He preferred them to be Southern, or at least Southern born, and really polished and dignified in how they looked and behaved. So he ended up building a tremendous cohort of men and women who were polished, relatively well-educated, and ready to organize in response to him because they were the largest group of privately employed Black people in the nation, hundreds of thousands of them. And so he accidentally built what really looked like an organization from the very start. And so they came together both as people helping the community be lifted. There's a picture of a porter who migrates to Los Angeles from Texas with his family and is able to really build a wonderful life for himself and his family. And so many porters were like that. They were able to move away from the hardest circumstances of the rural South and build lives and communities in migratory places around the country. And so they were guides for what the migration could be. They were helping people find jobs, homes, community in that process. One of the stories that I like the most is that one of my Pullman porters was literally on the train saying, "I'm going to San Francisco," and the porter sat him down and he was like, no, you're not. That's not a good place. There's no neighborhood there for you. You need to go to Oakland. And here's where you can find a place to live. Here's the lady. I'll give you the address. And, really guided him on the train to be connected to community and support as he migrated from Texas to Oakland. And so what was powerful here was the degree to which the Porters, once they're organized in the 1930s, 1937, under the New Deal, they are able to finally be recognized as a union, and the Pullman Company is forced to negotiate with them. And Black women made such a difference in that fight for the recognition of the Pullman Porters. Women like Ida B. Wells in Chicago, after she fled for her life, she begins to organize for the Porters organization in her own home and in her networks of Black women in the city. And so it was not just a men's fight, it was also everyone's fight for their recognition. And so in turn, when they become a union, they are focused on not just lifting their own salaries and their own ability to do things. They immediately begin demanding more workers' rights for all Black workers. They demand the desegregation of employment in the Second World War, and they have that desegregated, and that the access to defense jobs for Black women and Black men in that time period are open because of A. Philip Randolph, their leader, is really demanding that. But many of the Black women workers had slipped through the cracks of how federal protections were supporting workers over time. And so I wanted to think a little bit about women like my grandmother, who was educated, had a high school education from Thomasville High School. And when she moved to Philadelphia, could not find a white collar job, could not be hired in any kind of federal employment. All she could find were jobs serving as a domestic worker in households. So she had to live away from my mother, who was 2 at the time, and live in a white household for her employment when she got to Philadelphia. And so often we think of domestic work as being Southern, and that this is work that Black women are doing in the South, but the numbers are quite striking. Most women who end up doing domestic work, the millions of them, are in the North. Many of those women had done agricultural work in the South, and then were, because of the lack of access to other kinds of jobs as they migrated, end up doing domestic work. And so there's a real boom in domestic work in the 20th century for Black women. And that was striking to me. It's not really part of how we talk about it. The other thing that I wanted to do for these women was to talk about the humiliations that they suffered in doing this work, the separation from their children and their families, and the way that those households could be really corrosive to them as people. They weren't with other women all day long. They were isolated oftentimes. And then sometimes they were really humiliated. The woman that I was from Accomack who migrated to Philadelphia, she ran away at 16 to do this work. In the North, she thought it was going to be better. And she ends up with a job at a drugstore in Philadelphia, where the woman insisted that she wash the floor of the drugstore on her hands and knees, to dip her hand uncovered into this hot bucket of ammonia and water and scrub a public space while people were walking in and out of the store past her. And she really talked about the humiliation and the embarrassment that she had, that she wasn't allowed to use a mop to do this work, that she had to be on her hands and knees. And what was powerful is that I remember both my grandmother and my mother insisting that the best way to do a floor was on your hands and knees. And when I was little, I was like, well, what's wrong with the mop? Like, why can't we do this? But then it clicked on for me, particularly after I saw this picture, a series of pictures of a Black woman washing on her hands and knees. And I saw stories over and over again of women being asked to do labor on their hands and knees, and not allowed to use a mop. And so the corrosive way in which households could tell Black women how to do the labor in those spaces made it really difficult work, and arduous work that sapped at their dignity a bit. there were systematic challenges for domestic workers as well. This is a photograph of what was called the Bronx slave market. So during the Great Depression, where women were unable to find long-term jobs, they would stand on street corners in Bronx, and people would pull up and barter with them to try and get them to hire them for day labor at a very low price most of the time. And they were vulnerable, again, to abuse, to attack, to sexual abuse. And those kinds of markets existed all over the North. They existed in Philadelphia. My grandfathers both talked about their going to those spaces and being bartered down for day labor. Those spaces still kind of exist today. If we go to Home Depot or Lowe's, we will see people being bartered down for day labor. Those workers have no protections. They often suffer from wage theft. And sometimes Black women talked about people trying to pay them in old clothes after they were done with a full day's worth of labor. What was also powerful for me to figure out was I could see a boom in the number of Black women domestics at the same time that white women were entering industrial work. The story of Rosie the Riveter is one that we all are familiar with and have been taught a lot about. But what was powerful for me to figure out is that Rosie the Riveter had a Black maid. The ways in which white women were able to enter the workforce during this time period when men were away was by using the labor of Black women who were not initially hired in those higher paying domestic labor defense jobs, but instead were paid less to enter into white households to support their labor. And so that two-layered inequality was quite striking, and you could see it. Those changes don't happen until Mary McLeod Bethune and A. Philip Randolph organized to protest to get Black women access to those jobs at the end of the war. And those jobs were high paying and made a difference. Of course, they were the first fired when men returned home and stripped of those opportunities in that generation. The other space that I wanted to think about was postal work and how important it is. Oftentimes we associate Black people with postal work automatically. They are actually currently around 25% of postal employees in the country, so higher than their population. But this work doesn't start out that way. What's really powerful to look at is that the federal government 4 times in law prohibited the hiring of Black men or women for postal work. 4 times. I don't know how you have to do something 4 times in the law. It seemed like once or maybe twice we do it. And so that the very first Black postal workers who are hired are Civil War veterans. This is William Carney. He was part of the Massachusetts 54th, which was made famous by the film Glory. And he fought in that famous battle at Fort Wagner, where the flag fell because the flag bearer had been shot and killed. He picked up the flag and kept it moving forward so the soldiers could see where the line was. He was shot 5 times in that battle. He's wearing his Union coat as he delivers the mail in Massachusetts. He's probably the second Black person hired to work for the Postal Service in the United States. And so there's a connection between postal work and Black people in this country because of their advocacy, their fight to get access, to be recognized as citizens, to participate in the only working class labor that's delineated in the American Constitution. It's really powerful for them making the case for their citizenship after the Civil War. And Black men and women are having to fight for access to be able to be chosen after taking the civil service exam. And so there's so much organizing that leads into it. But then there's also the organizing that postal workers are able to give back. They are at the center of the civil rights movement. They're at the center of the Montgomery bus boycott of the Freedom Summer of 1964. They're doing so much to help build and organize, and not only their own ranks, but all people in this country. And so their fight for inclusion was a powerful and important fight. So thank you so much for listening to me for this talk. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Shout out to South Jersey.
I know, right?
Born in Camden.
Oh, me too. I was born at Cooper.
But yeah, so speaking of Pennsylvania,
Mm-hmm.
my family was in the steel mills in Pittsburgh
Mm-hmm.
instead. So part of the history, with the strikes, the Homestead strikes,
Mm-hmm.
there's a story about the strike breakers, those jobs that the whites didn't want to do, process
Mhm.
picket line, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that the blacks came across the picket line and worked. And as a result, there was like this massive riot thing, and 50 blacks were killed. So I wonder what you know about that.
So oftentimes, Black workers were being lured by labor agents to come say, there are jobs here. And so when they would come to a new place and then they would figure out, there's a whole fight here. They're not offered jobs scot-free. They're offered jobs to break strikes and to be a wedge against white workers. And so those were really awful conflicts because, people didn't have much choice, right? They were brought there by these labor agents. They owed them money for bringing them there, and they had to work. Like they weren't from there. They couldn't go back home. And so the manipulation of Black workers oftentimes was really a powerful tool that capitalists used to break strikes.
Yeah. So when you said they were brought there, I can hear about where were they brought from?
From the South.
The Pinkertons had already been like, that thing had happened. Then the thing in 1892 happened. So these labor union organizations went into the South and
There were labor agents all over the South offering people jobs, and oftentimes that was manipulative.
Yeah.
Part of the reason why the National Urban League was created was to make sure that Black workers understood that they had support as they migrated and weren't as manipulated by these labor fights and strikes. And so I think the other piece is that oftentimes when white workers were organizing unions, they would create all white unions that didn't allow Black workers to be in different labors and professions. So for example, when my grandfather moved to Philadelphia, he was a carpenter and wanted to join the carpenters union. It had been all white unions. They let him join, but then they sent him to jobs that were 100 miles from Philadelphia, and where he had no housing and no support. And if he couldn't do the job, they were like, well, then, they would slur him and they would say, just quit, just leave. And so the systematic blocking of Black workers from white unions is also part of that dynamic.
yeah. That's very manipulative. They didn't know until they got there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's not a question, but I comment about the Pullman's
Mm-hmm.
organization. Well, my uncle, James Austin from Chatham County, was in Buffalo, New York, is where he worked and lived. And that was what he did. He was a Pullman for years. And to hear some of his stories and how they had to act, dress, I mean, it was exactly as you said. And to share one story with you, it's kind of funny that he was serving white people and they ordered peaches. So he went to the kitchen, got the peaches, and Gabe sat down in front of the lady. And he was standing there looking at it, and there was a worm in the peaches. So what he did, he kept talking to the woman while she was eating them. She ate all the peaches, the worm and all. Then he just took the plate and left. After she finished it. He said, he knew that if she realized there was a worm, his job was gone, But yeah, I mean, it was more of a distraction, entertainment, for white passengers.
Yeah, yeah. Mr. Singleton, who I write about, talked about his tolerance bucket. And he said his bucket would get real full sometimes, when people would call him out of his name or slur him or, demand, that they be waited on before other customers and those kinds of things. So it was, he talked a lot about, all the struggles he had and also the struggles because his hub was in Utah. And he was there for a very long time and could not purchase a home because of the racism there. And it took him almost a decade for he, to be able to settle his family there. And when they finally moved into what was an all-white neighborhood, because there weren't that many Black people in the town, the people asked him if they had tails and could they see them, because they were taught that Black people were like animals. And so it was, they had to tolerate a lot just to have the fruits of what they had been working on so hard for so many years. It was really something. So I had always known about the advocacy and the work of the union, but it was a pleasure to get to write about the Black women and men who did this work and what they had to endure, and to honor that and to uplift that as part of the story too. So thank you.
I was wondering, in your book, you really, masterful way, really make us understand what's going on beyond the individual people.
Mm-hmm.
So we have this context for all the different steps that the people in your family took. And I was wondering how you knew all these stories about people in your family, and I'm sure you found out a lot of things in your research that your family didn't even know, but I was just curious about how you went about digging out those stories.
So all of the people in my family were big storytellers. My mother rhythmically would tell me sometimes the same stories again and again, and I'd be like, "Mommy, I know that," and she'd be like, "Anyway," and she would just keep telling me. And so a lot of those stories are sort of imprinted in my mind. My grandfather was a big storyteller. My grandmother was. My dad was. And so they loved to just sort of fill in those gaps. They were considered older parents at the time, not old now, but they were in their late 30s. My dad was 40 when I was born. And so they wanted me to understand the world from what they had experienced growing up and how different it was, and the experiences and the journeys that their family took to be where we were. And they wanted me to be proud of it and have a good context for understanding all those things. So my mother, I'm probably a historian because of my mother, because she would spend time sort of describing how the world was different. She told me about the Iceman who would deliver ice to their apartment in Philadelphia and walk up the steps in the leather strap over his shoulder, carrying a big block of ice and put it in the ice box. She's like, this refrigerator thing is plugged in. It wasn't plugged into anything. It didn't have any power. And so the ice would just sort of slowly melt and keep the food cool. So you couldn't buy a lot of food. You just get a little bit to cook what you were going to eat in the next couple of days. And you had to gather that water and pour it out, get another delivery of ice. And so she just wanted me to be able to picture the world she grew up in. So she talked about laundry. She talked about the iron. She talked about, devices to wring the water out of clothes. And her mom's hand got snapped into the rollers of a washing machine one time, and she had to bang it open when she was a little girl. And so just all those kinds of things she wanted me to know and to understand. She traveled south every summer, so she talked about those experiences up in the mountains of North Carolina with her grandfather. And so I just had, rich, descriptive background in sort of thinking about her past. And so I think I've always written in a way that is rich and descriptive and tries to recreate worlds because of the way she did that for me. And so I've been gathering these stories, and I never thought I would do anything. I mean, because in grad school, you're taught, your family's not important. Don't write about your family. selfish and not objective. And so writing for trade was an exciting opportunity because they wanted something personal, they wanted something human. And so all those stories were back there waiting. All the genealogical work I had done in my family, I was doing for fun and just entertainment because I'm a history nerd. So it was cool to be able to use all those things.
I have a family story about when ICE was being delivered to the home. And when I was born, my mother had two families. Her first husband died, and I'm in the second family. So my half sisters were teenagers when I was born, and so the person delivering the ice came in, and my sister had a crush on the guy who's delivering the ice, and so she wanted to impress him. So she was reading a book, and then he came over and said to her, "You know, it would be better if you turned it this way."
He's trying to look intellectual for the Iceman.
But he was a very handsome guy delivering the ice, and they married later.
Oh, I bet he was really strong. That was probably what he had a kind of good up. Other questions?
I know you say you grew up in New Jersey.
I did.
So did you spend summers in?
I came south. I had cousins in Winston-Salem, and so I would come south, and we would trade family reunions too. And so that family reunion that you saw the picture of at the beginning, that was in New Jersey. But then we would come to Winston, and then we would go up into the mountains where I had cousins and family too. So I did spend a lot of time. My mother didn't send me south like the whole summer, like she was sent south. But we definitely visited for a few weeks every summer. And then, my grandmother, her yard, she had a big garden and yard in South Jersey when she finally was able to move out of Philadelphia. And so I always felt as though it was sort of like transformed into what she had wanted in South Carolina where she was born. So she grew corn and okra and tomato and greens, and she had grapevines, and she canned and froze food. And so she just, recreated, she had fruit trees. So she did all this cooking and gardening and tending. So I would be out there with her just running around, and she would teach me how to do all those gardening things and teach me how to pick the string bean without tearing the plant up and doing all those kinds of things that were hearkening back to her childhood. And so as much as I wasn't in the South, it was a kind of a rural Black community in South Jersey where she recreated her version of the South. Any other questions?
This isn't exactly about your book, but the center that you work at?
Yep.
The Center for
The Study of the American South.
The American South, and that you've been expanding the focus of that in your work to include probably more Black stories in history. Well, I'm wondering if the things coming down from the present administration, if that's under any threat.
I don't know of anything right now. And my focus is always on, telling a variety of stories through the center. And so our work includes, every kind of walk of life in the larger projects that we do in Southern Oral History, in our journal, Southern Cultures. And so I'm not making up anything. I'm not creating new stories. I'm not trying to insert anything. And so as a historian, I'm so proud of what I do. And so far, my chancellor has said, as long as the work we're doing is based in research and truth, then he will support it. And so I'm very hopeful that is the case going forward. But I'll keep doing the work as long as they would like to have me. And I'm tenured at the university, so I'll be there.
Glad to hear that the chancellor has made that statement.
He did make it in a meeting.
I wanted to compliment you and your group. I was able to come to the Legacy of Lynching event with Mary and Joe and some of the other people here, and it was amazing. It was really educational for me. I really didn't know about this very much. I moved down here from the north, and I thought the program was really beautiful.
Thank you
And
so
I wanted
much.
to compliment you on that, and I know you had a lot to do with that, and the way you wove everything together. So I just wanted to thank you for that beautiful program.
Thank you so much. I think one of the ways I want to change the center is to make sure that we are doing things for our community, so that the people in our state and in our area and in the nation, feels that the center is of service to them. And not just talking to other academics, but really sharing the good work that we do with everyone. So
I brought so many different communities, and I thought, yeah,
it was really powerful. So
it was powerful.
a lot of hard work though.
Yeah.
It took me like 2 weeks to recover. But worth it.
Could you tell, repeat again why your grandfather left and went to Philadelphia?
Which one? The out of Accomack?
Yes.
Well, he was a teenager, and he just wanted. He felt like the town was small, and that he wasn't really going to get the chance for a fair shot. He was very close to his grandfather, and his grandfather had rented land from a white man and had saved up enough to have be able to purchase it. And so he was getting ready to purchase it, and the man told him, "No, you don't need to. As long as we're together, trust me, I got you." And then a few years later, when he was older, he was evicting him from that land that he had been on all his life. And so at that point, I think he understood, you can work really hard, you can be very skilled, but you won't have anything if people aren't fair to you. And so he was very hopeful that he could build a life for his family and his children if he had fair treatment. And so he was able to do that and ended up buying property, and he was really good at pool. He won some property playing pool too. And so, he had some rental property, and he was good with his hands. He kept growing potatoes in Philadelphia, and he would drag my father out to South Jersey. First he had a victory garden during the war, and so he lost that after the war because they built housing on the land. So they would go to Pennsauken and grow potatoes, much to the consternation of my father, who had to get up at 4 a.m. on a Saturday and go get the bus to Pennsauken, New Jersey to work. And then he would give that food out in his neighborhood in North Philadelphia. And my dad was like, "We could be selling this." And he was like, "That's not the point. We're here to support each other and to give to each other." And so I write about his love of the sweet potatoes that he grew up growing, and how he continued that and brought that with him to Philadelphia. So he died before I was born, but he was a great storyteller. So I interviewed my dad and my uncle about him and his growing up.
Did you come across stories that go way back, like prior to emancipation?
Yes, I wrote about my ancestor Henry.
So because you kind of got into like the thinking and the observation and that whole determination, did you come across like as an enslaved person, like we're determined to get out of this?
Absolutely.
Because right after like 1866, they were already, warming, so they already had used the word primed.
Mm-hmm. I think, what was powerful about being, someone's property and deeply and closely controlled, you couldn't say much, and you couldn't really let your real thoughts show, and you had to act as though you were pleased with your circumstances. But underneath all that, they had an analysis of what was going on. They were listening. They would pay attention. And times of war definitely always made them pay closer attention to what was happening. I found one oral history with a person from the WPA narratives, and they said, their master told them to go pray for the Confederates to win. And they went into the woods, and so they prayed really hard for the Union, because they knew that whatever their master wanted was they needed the opposite. And so there was so much response that, W.E.B. Du Bois basically said Black workers were key to undoing the Confederacy because they refused to work. They were giving Confederate property to the Union troops as they came. They were sometimes being told to go bury food stores and dishes and silver and stuff that people wanted to keep, and instead they would take it straight to the Union lines. So people weren't realizing the degree to which enslaved people were paying attention, listening. They sort of became part of the atmosphere for them. They weren't thinking like, hey, these Black people have a whole analysis going. They were just thinking they were fine. They weren't that smart. They didn't understand. But there was a whole world of intelligence and brilliance and vision and politics behind the scenes. You could tell I'm writing another book, right? It's been fun to write.
Well, okay, can we get a round of applause for Dr. Kelley? Wonderful. I have one announcement. Please join us right here on April the 12th at 2 p.m. Author is Paul M. Green. The Murder of John Warder Stevens by the Ku Klux Klan in 1870 was a turning point in the fight for equal voting rights in North Carolina. Thank you all again for being here today. Please make sure you sign the register in the back of the room so we can invite you to our other programs for 2025. Have a safe rest of the weekend. Now we will have a drawing in the back for a free copy of Dr. Kelley's book, and she is here to, in case you want to publish a book, purchase a book. How much are they? Okay, in case you want to